Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is part 9 of What If Naruto was in Rosario Vampire. If you guys enjoyed this what if and want to see part 10 of it, comment down below and let me know. The like goal for this video is 200 likes. So like this video to let me know that you're interested in this series and you want the next part. And go ahead and check out other what ifs in the channel. Before we start, please do support for more awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like, and also share this video with your friends. So let's start this video. Carnage was probably the best word to describe what Naruto was seeing. Fires roared, setting all of the surrounding medical tents ablaze. There was no screams, no one panicking, not even a single person was in his sight, and it made the blonde clench his teeth. Hell, he would have preferred it if someone was running around, screaming in anguish as they were being burned, then there would have at least been a sign of life. He made his way through the base, his feet making quite crunching noises against the hot and dry sand. When he got to the first medical tent, he wanted to forget what he saw. The beds and medical supplies were strewn everywhere, the coating of charcoal covering them, and hiding the plus symbol that was usually on them. Around those objects was around 20 or so skeletal structures, with all of them being dark gray, bordering on black in color. What horrified him most though was that there were some burned structures in there that looked like they belonged to children that had been around the age of 8 to 12. Denins, maybe. He thought before he closed his eyes, and walked out of the tent, which began to collapse, not wanting to see any more, but he willed himself to move. If anyone was still alive, then he'd find them, and make sure they remained that way. There wasn't any blood in any of the tents he was able to search, before they came crashing down, just burned carcasses, medical supplies and beds. He sighed and dropped his hand back to his side as the last tent of the area he was about to search collapsed in on itself, still burning all the while. Before he could dwell on it any longer, a surge of chakra caught his attention, and his head whipped around just in time to see a colossal amount of sand spray into the air. He could have sworn he saw a flash of purple in there somewhere too. That's Sasuke, it has to be. He thought, sprinting off in the direction he'd seen it. But, who's he fighting? In closed the sliding door behind him, before making his way around the newspaper club's room to hand everyone a slip of paper that they didn't bother looking at straight away, and not really taking notice of the additional person. Once his task was done, he walked up to the front of the room and behind the desk. Alright everyone, pay attention. Mocha put the art book she'd been reading down on her desk, and gave the surprisingly serious-looking werewolf her attention, along with the others in the room. What are we supposed to be paying attention to, senpai? Naruto asked, his elbow on the desk he was sitting at, his chin resting in his palm. His senior put the newspaper he'd been holding flat on the desk, and surveyed the room, making sure they were paying attention before his eyes landed on Yukari, and he arched an eyebrow, finally noticing her. Who's she? Sendo Yukari, a witch and a new member in this club. She introduced, having moved her desk herself to sit between Naruto and Mocha, so she could both be next to the vampire, and keep an eye on the blonde, as, technically, their war was still going. Alright, whatever. He waved off, grabbing a piece of chalk and writing disappearance on the board. Anyway, the reason I came here is this recent missing girls problem that has come up. Missing girls? Sukune repeated while the three females in the room decided to pay more attention. That's what I said, Sukune-kun, but I don't remember asking for a parrot. The human huffed. Naruto smirked and Gin rolled his eyes before continuing, his tone taking on that seriousness it had before. Back to the subject, several missing female students have vanished without a trace lately, one after another. 7, to be more specific, in just a single month. He placed his hands on the desk on either side of the newspaper. Now, admittedly, it's not at all unusual for people to go missing in this school, but don't you think these numbers are unusual? Naruto grabbed the slip of paper Gin had handed around before, and gave it a look over. The number 7 is an unusual number. No, you idiot. Gin snapped and Naruto scowled at him. It's the fact that there's 7 females that have gone missing, not the number itself. You should be more specific then. Sukune sighed. Can we just get on with this? Gin grunted but obliged. I've collected some basic information on these girls and, as you can see on those pictures, all of them are pretty hot. If someone is holding them hostage, then I want to save them somehow. Naruto rolled his eyes, having a gut feeling as to where his senior was going with his words. After all, if they see me in a good light, I'll get a chance to get to know them better. Going by the lecherous smirk that had formed on the werewolf's face, and the way his words were phrased, he guessed his gut feeling was correct. Sukune shook his head. I should have expected something like this. Mocha, Kurumu, and Yukari, however, didn't seem amused or exasperated in the least, and were sending the president of their club dirty looks. So how do you plan on saving them then, senpai? Gin chose to ignore the lack of actual interest in Naruto's tone and sat down before answering. Have you guys do it, while I take all the credit with the girls. The blonde huffed through his nose while the others chose to ignore their conversation and went back to what they had been doing beforehand. And you think we'll do it even after you've said that? Of course. He kicked his legs up onto the desk and leaned back in his chair. After all, you guys are my underlings, so you have to do what I tell you to. That's not true. Yukari decided to pipe in. As our senior and club's president, you're supposed to help us out, not order us around like you say. I'm different. In what way? He trailed off, not actually having a reply to that which could ensure his victory in their small argument. Just because. When he saw everyone else in his club staring at him, he crumbled. Alright. I'll figure something out, maybe. Good. Naruto smirked at the werewolf who sent him an accusing stare for bringing up the subject in the first place. We wouldn't want our club's president to abandon us like that. If anything, the stare just worsened at his words. The second year sighed. Naruto was really laying it on heavy with the use of such an emphasis on his title of president. And going by the way his junior's lips were slightly curved upwards as he did his newspaper drafts, he'd wagered that the blonde knew exactly what he was doing. Later, Naruto-kun, Tsukune-kun. I'll see the two of you tomorrow. Naruto glanced to the side and saw that the vampire had stopped walking to wave at them, while she was a few feet away. Going somewhere. Yep. She nodded and brought her art book out to show them. I got asked by the art teacher to be a model for a picture, so I won't be able to go to the dorms with the two of you for the rest of the week. Is that why you were reading that book before? Yeah, it is. Naruto shrugged, ignoring the way she shuffled on her feet, as if she was nervous. We'll have fun then, and I guess we'll see you tomorrow. He took a step in the direction of the dorms, when he heard Mocha call out to him. Wait a minute, Naruto-kun. He stopped, turned around and, before he could even ask what, the vampire was upon him, her arms strung around his neck with her fangs digging in eagerly. He wrapped his arms around her to keep her steady inside. You know, Mocha-chan, it'd be nice if you asked every once in a while, instead of just sticking in. When she'd had her fill, she removed her fangs and smiled apologetically at him. Sorry, Naruto-kun, but I can't hold myself back for long. I'll try to remember to ask from now on though. Don't worry about it. They entangled themselves and Naruto fixed up his shirt as it had been messed up when she was basically rubbing herself all over him. When they'd said their goodbyes, Naruto and Tsukune continued making their way to their respective dorm rooms. You've been awfully quiet, you know. Have I? Yeah, what's wrong? Nothing, just thinking about stuff. Like, upcoming birthdays. Whose birthdays? Vroom. Tsukune's hand went up and over his own head, while the blonde blinked at him. That was the sound of my hand going straight over your head. Upcoming birthdays isn't much to go on. He protested. It's my birthday coming up soon, Naruto. How soon? June 22nd soon. Ah. He sighed, idly scratching at the back of his head. Well, you should have told me earlier, I would have gotten you something. It's fine, I didn't really expect anything, just wanted you to know. Naruto hummed as they kept walking, their shoes crunching along the path. I wonder if Karumu-chan's present for you will be her breasts. As the blonde had expected, Tsukune's face did a very good impersonation of one of those red light bulbs on a Christmas tree. What? Ah, well, you know. He sent a smirk towards the other human who had clamped a hand over his nose. I did accidentally grab them once, so I was just thinking about how much of a good present they'd be all things considered. Soft, yet firm and large enough to get an entire handful. At the blonde's description, Tsukune found out that his hand was no longer able to hold back the blood that shot out of his nose, while his eyes rolled into the back of his head, and his back hit the ground. Naruto snorted with a grin. You really can't take a joke, can you? Tsukune simply mumbled something incoherent in reply. He woke up throwing the covers off himself. He could feel his heart racing in what could be surprise or panic, maybe even both, and his eyes were wide open and alert, despite the fact he'd only just woken up. He hastily made his way over to his window, and pulled the curtains aside roughly, staring out into the dead-looking forest that was illuminated by the moonlight. There was something out there far away, something familiar. It was faint, terribly so, almost as if something was muffling, or possibly even blocking it to a certain degree, but it was there nonetheless. His grip tightened on the curtain he was still holding, the brain in his skull racing at a mile a minute so fast he couldn't even understand his own thoughts. Calm down, Naruto. Breathe. He flinched at the deep rumble, but relaxed a second later, when he remembered who had spoken, and did as told. His hands came back down, and he rested them on the windowsill, leaning on them slightly. Think first, have a panic attack later. He didn't even blink at the Biju's attempt at a lighter tone, but he again decided to listen. It's not possible, is it? I mean, I know that. I know, but it apparently doesn't seem that way. He took another calming breath, his heart rate slowed down, but it was still faster than it should be. Well, actually, I guess it's not entirely impossible, given the circumstances, but still. Kurama sighed. Your reaction is understandable, but it's not needed. Not yet, anyway. Yeah, you're right. His heart rate began to slow down until it was at normal speed once again. I guess I should get some sleep though, it is still a school night and all. Even as he drew his covers back over himself, he knew he wouldn't be able to get even a wink of sleep in. Did you come up with a plan yet? Naruto was sitting on the desk he usually sat at when he was in the newspaper club. His legs were crossed with a blonde brow raised, in questioning at the werewolf. They were the only two in the room at the moment, seeing as classes were still on. His legs kicked up on the desk at the front of the room, while leaning back on the chair and fiddling with his pendant. Gin answered without looking up. Not a plan, per se. I did sniff around literally for the scent of a group of females in one spot as their smell is different, but I couldn't find anything. It's not much of a surprise that you've basically memorized a female scent. Gin ignored his jab and continued as if he hadn't been interrupted. I also questioned some students and teachers who I suspected. Let me guess, they were females. Gin looked up and scowled at him. Stop interrupting me. Sorry. He apologized half-heartedly. It was a serious question though. His senior dug into his pocket and brought out a scrunched up piece of paper before tossing it to him. Like I said, I questioned teachers and students. None of them really stood out exponentially, but the ones who did stand out even slightly were written down on that paper you have in your hand right now. He unfurled the paper and read what was on it. Ishigami-sensei, the art teacher, Kasubo-sensei, the gym teacher, and some guy named Kaio who's in the public safety committee. He placed the paper in his lap and stared at Gin, who had put his hands behind his head and was slowly rocking back and forth on the chair. What are the reasons for those three specifically? You're going to fall off of that, by the way. Nah, I'll be fine. He kept rocking, but he did look at him. I'll start off with Ishigami. The reason she's on there is that she has taught a majority of the students who have gone missing, and I hear that she's rather popular with the girls of this school, which would make it easy for her to abduct them. Alright. He made a motion with his hand for him to go on. And Kasubo-sensei. Similar to Ishigami's, actually. He's the only gym teacher in the school at the moment, which means that he's had classes with all of these girls at least once. He's also supposed to be popular among the girls here. How so? He's a gym teacher. The werewolf said as if it explained it all, but Naruto just stared blankly at him. You know, fit, mature, older girls these days like that kind of stuff. He sighed remorsefully. A shame, too, all those young beauties wasted on someone like him. Anyway, Naruto said, trying to get the conversation moving. Kaio of the Public Safety Committee. Gin's expression darkened. He stopped rocking on the chair, and his eyes glazed over slightly, as if he was remembering something. It only lasted a second, before he seemed to snap out of it, a grim smile on his face instead. There's quite a few reasons for him, actually. He's the head of the committee, and he's a cruel bastard, to say the least. I wouldn't be surprised in the least if these abductions were played out just to provide him with some amusement. Naruto would bet a frown came to his face, when he sensed the emotions coming from the second year. Past experiences with him. You could say that. He ran a hand through his hair, and closed his eyes. Of course, I don't have any solid proof to lay the blame on any of these three, but I'd wager a few thousand in cold, hard cash that it's one of them. Naruto perked up. Do you want to make a bet on it? No? Gin fixed him with an annoyed look. I heard what you did to those casinos in Vegas. Naruto huffed, feeling somewhat offended. You make it sound like I robbed them or something. You might as well have. He rolled his eyes. That wasn't true. Whatever. Did you end up getting anything out of the three of them? Nothing solid. Gin answered quickly, a bit too quickly. When I did question them, it was mostly just changes in facial expressions, clenched teeth, twitches, that sort of stuff. Okay, a bit of a twist in the truth. He has spoken to Ishigami and Kasubo, he just avoided Kaio. Besides, even if it was Kaio who done it, it wasn't like they'd be able to do anything against him. Naruto's mouth became a thin line. He felt as if Gin was telling the truth, mostly anyway, but it was as if the werewolf was holding something back. He shook it off. Whatever it was could wait, he supposed. What do you plan on doing next then, President? Gin gave him a look for using his title in that way again. I don't know, why don't you try doing something for once? Because you're the president of this club. Naruto retorted before rolling his eyes, when Gin scowled at him. Alright, fine, I'll sneak around and see what I can find. But you owe me, senpai. Sneaky wasn't his style. Naruto had known that already, of course, but it didn't help the fact that he was annoyed at what he was doing. He much preferred face-to-face confrontations. His shoes hit the ceiling with every step he took, making light thudding sounds every time that were beginning to drive him insane with their monotonous repetition. The halls of Yokai Academy were dark. The shadows of the many dead trees outside could be seen courtesy of the currently crescent-shaped moon's light. It was quiet too, and Naruto didn't like it. If there was anything he'd learned in his life, it was that quiet was bad. Things just didn't go smoothly for him in situations where he could be killed if he were caught, ever. Like that one time when he'd snuck into Sarutobi's office at around 5 years of age with various items, paint bombs, wire, and a bag filled with the stuff the Hokage had used to fill his pipe with. He remembered getting into the office without much trouble, even going as far as reaching the Sandaime desk really quietly, then creak. He couldn't remember exactly what had happened, but within the next second he remembered finding himself pinned to the floor with a kunai at his throat, with the form of a surprised-looking Sarutobi hovering over him. He hadn't realized it back then, but if the Hokage had let his instinctual reactions get the better of him for just a second longer, then he would have been killed by his grandfather figure, no less. Stop it, he told himself, his lips in a firm line. You need to keep moving. He reached his destination, the art room, the only place in the entire school he could actually sense multiple yokai signatures in one spot. Still stuck to the ceiling, he slid the door open as quietly as he could. There was a small sound, like one would hear when one of those trolley things that held trays filled all sorts of medicine rolled along the floor of a hospital. He'd heard plenty of those. As soon as he entered, the sound of sobbing reached his ears. Being the heroic and gracious person he was, definitely not a biased opinion, he of course made his way over there without any hesitation. He dropped to the floor and made his way over, his shoes making a slightly different sound, but it didn't help the fact that he felt like going insane. With each step he took, the sobbing grew louder, and he soon found himself standing in front of a rectangular metal box, with a set of 4 grates near the top of it standing up vertically. He couldn't see very well in the dark, but there was enough moonlight coming, in that he could tell he was in the corner of the room, opposite the sliding door, and up the front. There was definitely someone in there. As soon as the obvious thought came into his mind, he felt like punching himself. He resisted the urge and grasped the lock that had been placed on the box in a firm grip. He pulled, and when the steel, upside-down U that was responsible for locking it seemed to groan in protest, he just pulled harder until there was a satisfying snap. The lock came flying off, and Naruto found he'd used quite a lot of force in pulling, as it was flung out of his hand, and carried by the momentum before it clanged somewhere on the opposite side of the room. He pulled the entrance door of the metal box open, and what he saw made him blink. It was a statue made of stone, that much he was completely sure of, but it had sobs emanating from it, while petrified tears seemed to run down the face that wore a terrified expression. Okay, that's kinda weird. He waited, expecting a snort or some sort of sarcastic remark on how obvious his statement was to come from the biju inside of him, but there was nothing. Oh well, the damn fox was probably being lazy and sleeping again. Again, he waited. Yeah, if Kurama didn't react to that, then he was sleeping. Before he could hope to do anything, though, he heard the sliding door to the art room begin open, and strangely enough the sobbing stopped. The rash side of his brain kicked in, and he slammed the metal door close, causing a rather loud bang. He wasn't done yet, however, and he rammed his back into it, tilting the entire rectangular box backwards until it hit the wall. What was that? Who's there? He groaned in full pain, and he could almost picture whoever was there giving his position their full attention. He got off the rectangular box, held his shoulder as if he was in pain, and forced on a grimace. It's just me, he called out in what he hoped was a non-hostile tone. The lights flickered on, and Naruto was greeted to the side of the art teacher, Ishigami, giving him a dark look as her hand came down to rest at her sides again. The expression only stayed for a second though, and when he blinked he saw her giving him a more of an annoyed and exasperated look. "You're Naruto-kun, right? One of Mocha's friends." "Yeah." He hoped it sounded weak. "I am, but how did you know?" Her expression softened. "She's one of my students, she talks about you sometimes, actually." "Really?" He didn't need to fake his surprise. "Why?" She shrugged. "I don't know, but she seems to have a soft spot for you." She gained a stern look. "But that doesn't matter right now. What does matter is why you're sneaking around in my art room at this time of night. You should be at your dorm sleeping." "Yeah, sorry." He apologized with as much sincerity he could muster in the situation he'd found himself in. He'd known there was teachers in the school, probably some students stealing sheets to cheat from, too, but he'd foolishly ignored them as they had been a fair distance away. When he saw her looking at him expectantly, he went on. "I really like art, sensei. Drawing, painting, all those things just really grab my attention, do you know what I mean?" "Most certainly. But I don't want others to find out, you see. It's kind of embarrassing for me." He grimaced again, tightening the grip on his shoulder to keep up his act. "I just ran out of supplies, too, so I thought that I'd come to the art room and steal some. Borrow some supplies, just for a short time, I would have brought them back." He sighed, dropping his head, so she couldn't see his expression, something he guessed that people who were embarrassed did when they had been caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. "I can't see well in the dark though, sensei, and I ended up running in that thing." He gestured to the tilted metal box. "And hurting my shoulder pretty badly." "Well," she said, sighing tiredly. "At least you were honest about it, and for that I won't issue you a punishment." Her stern look came back with a vengeance. "But if I ever see or hear of you doing something like this again, then there will be punishment, do you understand?" "Yes, sensei," he murmured, feeling relieved, and he hoped it showed on his face. "I'll be going now." Did she roll her eyes? Yes, and make sure to see the nurse in the morning about that shoulder of yours." She moved to the side and swept her arm, a gesture for him to hurry up and leave. Mocha looked up, her green eyes settling on the woman at the front of the class. The teacher, a 30-year-old looking woman with an herbless figure, braided hair, a bandana on the top of her head, a tube top, slim jeans, a golden necklace, and to finish it off was a long white trench coat that reached her ankles with. Even though Milka couldn't see the entire coat, she'd wager that it had paint on it in some areas. Okay, in our class today, you'll be painting pictures continuing with last week's theme of what's important to you. The teacher Ishigami announced. Her hands twitched every so often as if she wanted to finish a masterpiece, and when she pronounced the letter S, there was a slight hiss in her tone that was almost unnoticeable. And just what is important to you is the art in each and every one of your hearts. So feel free to paint whatever you want. Milka smiled. She enjoyed art class. It let her imagination run free, and it was something that she could put her emotions into. The teacher wasn't bad either. She was passionate about the subject, and she would give pointers and constructive criticism to her students. She looked down at her desk, which was slightly larger than normal ones that had her A3-sized art book resting on it, with a blank page open. She could hear students talking amongst themselves or to Ishigami, probably to ask for help. She tried to pay them no attention and concentrate, but it wasn't exactly easy considering she didn't have anything specific to concentrate on in the first place. The girl leaned in through one of the open windows at the side of the classroom and waved at the art teacher, a cheerful smile on her face. "Hey sensei, I'm skipping my gym class to have fun with you." "Oh, you?" She waved off with a flattered smile before walking over and starting a conversation with the girl. Milka tried to settle on something specific, but couldn't. She had a few good ideas running around in her head, which was the reason as to why she couldn't decide. She was so in thought that when she heard Ishigami ask her what she was planning to do, she squeaked and reflexively covered her art book, even though there was nothing on there. "Ah, sensei," she murmured, a small, embarrassed blush on her face once she'd realized her position. "Sorry, I wasn't concentrating." "It's alright, there's nothing to be sorry for." Ishigami smiled, but there was a predatory gleam in her eyes similar to one a snake would get when they their eyes on their food. She pushed the thoughts away and smiled back, her arms coming to rest back in their previous position. Seeing she now had her students' attention, she decided to ask her question again. "So do you have anything in mind yet, Milka-san?" "Ah, well." She shuffled around on her seat nervously, the flush on her face simmering down to a much smaller scale. "I've got a few ideas, but I can't decide on what one." Ishigami simply smiled once again, the predatory gleam remaining. "It's because you're overthinking it." She brought up her index finger and lightly tapped it on her chest, right above her heart. "Like I said before, this is about what's important to you, so you've got to let your heart decide, not your brain." "I know that, but..." "Here." Ishigami leaned down so she was eye level with the vampire, and her smile widened slightly. "Let me see if I can help you out." When the class had finished, and students including herself had began to file out, she felt a hand grab her arm roughly, and hold her in place, 2 meters from the door. She turned her head back and saw her teacher standing there, stopping her from moving. "Sensei." Ishigami smiled, her eyes gaining that same predatory gleam they had before, making the vampire nervous. "Sorry," she said, but she didn't sound very sincere. "But I can't let you go, we have some things to discuss." "Hey, what are you two talking about?" Naruto glanced behind him at the succubus who had asked the question. She was sitting at one of the desks in the front row of the class, leaning back, unknowingly pushing her breasts up and looking at him, and the werewolf beside him. Yukari was in the desk beside her, some weird ball that the blonde really didn't care to ask about on it. Gin and himself were at the side of the room, looking out the window and talking about what he had found the night before in the art room. "It's nothing important, Kurumi-chan," he said dismissively, before looking back out the window again, ignoring the small huff that he heard come from her. "So, about the statue you were telling me about." Gin trailed off, letting him continue telling him what he had found. "Yeah, it was a statue." He rolled his eyes when Gin looked at him expectantly, as if he was telling him to say more on the matter. "What do you want me to tell you?" "It was a statue of a girl, it had tears running down its face, and there was someone alive inside of it. And it was on its own. It was in a metal, rectangular just big enough to fit one person, so yeah, there was only one." The werewolf wrinkled his nose at the way he'd phrased his retort, but didn't comment, and instead reached into his pocket, before bringing out a piece of paper with a photo of a very familiar-looking girl or statue on it. "I needed to know, because this girl went missing yesterday not very long after I spoke to you, actually. Seemed familiar." He took the piece of paper and looked it over, making sure there was nothing outstanding that was different. He didn't want to say "oh, yeah, this is the girl," only for it not to be. And he certainly didn't want to say "no, it's not her, completely different girl, senpai" either. "Yeah, almost exact replica of the statue." "Almost? Well, you know, without the stone coating." Gin looked like he was about to say something, maybe complain about his reply, but Yukari's voice suddenly cried out. "Guys, there's a bad aura enveloping Milka-san." Acting on instincts at the worried tone of the witch, he delved into his negative emotion sensing ability. The negative emotions that he could always feel from around the school, amplified when he concentrated on them: anger, jealousy, annoyance, hate, sadness, all kinds of stuff. He pushed past it and zeroed in on Milka, and anyone within a few meters of her person. Fear and obviously hostile intentions reached him within a second after Yukari's declaration, and he turned around, making his way towards the door. Yeah, I got it, Yukari-chan. Even if I think that divination stuff you're doing is. He pursed his lips, thinking of the right word. Inaccurate, I'll believe you this time. Bye. The door rolled shut behind him, muffling Yukari's infuriated shout, and Gin's annoyed grunt at his sudden departure. She managed to yank her arm away from Ishigami, thankfully, and create some space between them, maybe around 3 or 4 meters. Ishigami removed the bandana that had been atop her head, and put it in one of her coat pockets. Milka's attention went to the top of the older woman's head, and found something she'd rather not see, ever. Her once braided hair had transformed into what looked like hundreds of different snakes, all flailing and curling round each other, as if they had a mind of their own. They weren't exactly snakes though, she could tell that much. They didn't have eyes, for one, and the fangs they had were way oversized, not to mention they were much more grotesque looking overall. What's happening to you all of a sudden, Ishigami-sensei? She cried, taking more and more steps away from her art teacher, but Ishigami just took steps forwards to match her pace. Your hair, it's like snakes. Yes, I changed my hair, thanks for noticing. Do you like it? She smiled and squinted her eyes, an expression that her homeroom teacher, Nikoname, usually wore, just without the glasses. But I'm afraid that this has to be done. You see, your friend, Naruto-kun saw more than I would have liked last night, and I might need a bargaining chip. What are you talking about? The vampire asked hesitantly. She stopped moving backwards, when her back hit a door and she tensed, while Ishigami kept moving onwards, the cold glint appearing in her eyes when she opened them. Don't worry, my dear, you won't even feel a thing. With that set of words said, the snakes that acted as hair launched forward, as if by some silent order. Before Mocha could react, one of the snakes had latched onto her left wrist with enough force that it sent her crashing through the door. She winced and bit back a groan. The sound of sobbing reached her ears and she got up on her knees, surveying the area she'd been forced into. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw numerous stature 7, she counted, littered around the room, all in different poses. They all had tears streaming down their faces, horrified expressions, and were all statues of girls. What is this? She made a move to stand up, but on the way she found her left hand wasn't responding to her. She looked down and was once again surprised to see it coated in stone. My hand's covered in stone. It's the Medusa power of transformation into stone. The familiar voice of Ishigami declared, followed by the sounds of footsteps and quiet hissing. Milka turned her head around to see her art teacher walking through the broken doorway. Anything bitten by one of my snake-like hairs will turn into stone. You too will be turned into stone just like those girls you see. She gripped her stone-covered hand, as if holding it would help in some way. Then all these statues are. Yes. She answered for her, a wicked grin playing on her lips. They're all the beautiful students of this academy, don't you think it's fantastic? That's when Milka noticed, her face had changed somewhat. Mottled lines had formed under her eyes, and she had grown fangs that showed in her grin. She was going to say they weren't fantastic, stall and try to figure a way out, but Ishigami was having none of it. Her hair lunged forwards again, going further than it should have been possible given the teacher's actual hair length. The door rolled open and there was a slamming sound, followed by a blur of blonde and something shiny, and Milka suddenly found Naruto standing in front of her, one of those tri-pronged kunais held in his hands, while the heads of Ishigami's hair were on the floor, writhing around and snapping at nothing. Geez. He complained, pinching the bright of his nose. Why do all the enemies go after you? Am I not important enough or something? Milka blinked incredulously, while Ishigami seemed to be a vibrating ball of rage. You. She murmured as her face decided to take on the rage she was feeling. Her expression turned into a snarl, nostrils flaring while the snakes on her head snapped at anything in range, seemingly going into their own frenzy. You killed my snakes. Well, not really. The blonde pointed to the wriggling round heads that were still snapping. One had even managed to latch onto another, and was in the middle of devouring it. I mean, look, they're still moving, so they're alive. Get your facts straight, lady. The already rather horrid look on Ishigami's face worsened, becoming more grotesque than it already was. The snakes on top of her head stopped acting randomly and looked directly at Naruto, as if they had just been ordered to turn him into a garden ornament. They lunged forward and Naruto rolled his eyes. Milka couldn't really tell, but the kunai he was holding seemed to get some sort of glow to it. There was power coming from it, she realized. He was pouring the chakra that he used into it. He flicked his wrist and the kunai flew forwards, going straight in between all Ishigami's hair. But despite this, all of the snakes were suddenly torn to shreds at random points, the little bits of them falling to the floor and wriggling around. The heads snapped at anything they could reach, while the parts that couldn't just moved around on their own. Ishigami screamed at the sight, while the that had kept going straight for her stopped around a meter in front of her body, being held in place by his hand. He sighed, and Milka stared at the two of them. She hadn't seen him move, not even a blur, any sort of sign that he'd moved in the first place. He was in one place, then he was in another. You're all the same. Was it a slight whine to his voice? Anyone I fight seems to just get angry when they start losing. It'd be more fun if you actually thought things through, that way I can kick your ass some more. Ishigami stared at him, eyes full of rage and a hint of fear. What? Mocha saw him wrinkle his nose in distaste, or maybe it was displeasure. I don't like that either, how when you know you're going to lose you don't do anything, people like you always just stand there and take it. Do you think I want to just beat on someone who's not moving? How boring. But, Ishigami mumbled. She went in for a slap something. But Naruto just grabbed her hand and huffed. Don't bother. He snapped irritably. It's too late now, I shouldn't have to tell you what to do. Before Ishigami could even open her mouth, he already had his fist buried into her gut, and her body went slack. All the same stuff over and over. Naruto-kun, why are you complaining? Mocha asked tentatively as he let Ishigami's body drop to the floor with a thud. Ah, it's nothing. He said dismissively before turning around to face her, a small smile on his face. Come on, let's get out of here. We'll go get the others and bring these statues, girls, whatever, to the infirmary. We need to get that hand checked out, too. Had he been taught how to sneak around and spy on people? Not very much. Had he been taught how to be observant? He'd been told he should be more aware of his surroundings, but he never really was. His mind was always concentrating on something more interesting. Had he been taught how to defeat other shinobi who could be considered gods among men over the past month? Definitely. His sandals crunched against the sand as he raced along it, towards the battle, that could probably be felt for miles. He'd lost count of how many shock waves he felt, lost count of how long he'd been running the same direction, and he'd certainly lost count of how many times he'd seen sand get blown into the air in colossal amounts. The closer he got, the more frequent the shock waves became. He just guessed it was because he was getting closer. Sand sprayed into the air again, a thunderous roar followed, and he felt a pressure slam into him, another shock wave. He pushed through it, he had to. Sasuke was still alive and kicking, fighting someone from his clan to the death. The clouds were dark and stormy, something he'd only just taken notice of. Flashes of lightning appeared every now and then, illuminating parts of the sky in a brilliant blue. Another round of shock waves, random appearances of lightning, and Naruto found himself standing on a large sand dune, observing a fight between the person who was supposed to be his best friend, and someone he hadn't seen since the alliance retreated upon Obito becoming a Jinchuriki. Sukune, why are you staring out the window? Naruto tapped a pencil in his hands on his desk, sending an annoyed stare to the human who had turned away from the window to look at him blankly. Well, I just kind of realized that the seasons don't change here. He grabbed his blazer as if he was showing it to him. I mean, we're still in the winter uniform. He rolled his eyes. Wow, what a thing to take notice of. He drawled and Sukune crossed his arms in a huff. Get back to your work already. Your birthday was yesterday, not today, so you don't get the day off again. Sukune pursed his lips. Naruto was betting that he'd enjoyed his day off. You know, you just acted more like the club's president in a few short seconds than Gin has since we joined. Yeah. Yukari agreed. Sitting at the desk, she moved in between Naruto and Mocha. Nothing unusual. She gestured to Gin, who was reclining in his chair with a coffee in his hand. Just look at him. He's like one of those fan fiction authors who lays around and don't pay attention to their stories. Just replace the coffee with a pizza and soda combo, then he'd be an exact replica. I'm not lazing around. Gin protested, taking a sip of his coffee without even bothering to look up from the newspaper held in his free hand. Yes, you are. Mocha piped up. Naruto saw Gin's lips form a firm line. Okay, maybe I am. But it doesn't matter, I don't need to do the work. See? Yukari frowned, stood up and pointed to him. He's exactly like those fan fiction authors that are always saying, oh, it's just fan fiction, who cares, or my life is more important than fan fiction, bah. She threw her hands up in the air and sat back down, huffing through her nose. Then they don't update for months, and when they do, they wonder why no one is reading their story anymore. Wow. Naruto mumbled, slightly awed by the young witch's rant. That was something else, Yukari-chan. She beamed at him while Kurumu stretched in her chair and let out a yawn. Fan-fiction authors and useless presidents aside. She ignored Gin's glare. I don't think I can take much more of this. It's Saturday, I want to do something, not sit around like this. Yeah, well, we're all stuck here, Kurumu-chan. But if Senpai actually did something, it'd go a lot faster. Naruto gave Gin a pointed look, but he ignored it. The succubus groaned and leaned over, resting her head on Sukune's shoulder as their desks were close together, while sad human looked away. You're my only safe haven, Sukune. Boring. That was probably the best word to describe handing out newspapers that was in Naruto's vocabulary. He scowled as he handed another paper to a boy who looked disappointed that he was the one handing it to him. Don't want it. Leave. He snapped and the boy jumped before grabbing the newspaper and leaving. He sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. Maybe snapping at people like that wasn't the best idea, but it wasn't his fault. He came to the skull at first because he thought it'd give him a chance to have a life without being in life and death situations all the time, but the truth was that's exactly what he wanted. It was basically in his blood to risk his life all the time. It only made it worse that there was usually someone to fight, but they weren't really providing any competition for him. It was annoying him, and he was getting restless. Coming to school probably hadn't been his best idea. It was like he was locked in a cage, a large cage with his friends, but a cage nonetheless. He took a deep breath and let it out through his nose, before glancing around at the other members of his club, the friends he'd made. They were smiling as they handed out newspapers, even Sukune, though he did look a bit miffed whenever he handed someone a newspaper who ended up getting a disappointed expression. He straightened up and forced on an easy smile, before handing a newspaper to an admittedly cute girl. Out of the corner of his eyes he saw Kurumu glump Sukune, and smash his head between her breasts, exclaiming how happy she was that the newspaper was so popular. A small chuckle escaped him. Maybe Kurumu's present for him had been her breasts after all. I'm scared. Lolicans are skoy. Yukari cried as she ran away from a flock of male students. He put it to the back of his mind, and picked up a newspaper from the stand they were handing out the papers at. At least all the work we've been doing for these isn't for nothing. He put the paper down and glanced over to the side, when he felt a familiar yokai approaching and saw Gin approaching with his hands in his pockets. He arched an eyebrow. As far as he knew, Gin was pretty lazy, and didn't show much care or interest in the club at all, just his own benefits. How's it going? Are you giving out lots of copies? Oh, hi, senpai. Mocha greeted in a cheerful mood. Gin surveyed the area with his eyes, and saw all the people surrounding the stand that Kurumu was currently attending to. He looked pleased, glad, even. It looks like it's a pretty big hit, huh? Gin smiled slightly, but it wasn't the smile he showed off to girls he was trying to woo. It was a smile one would get when they saw something that was once broken get fixed. We might even need to start charging for these. That's fine with me, senpai. Naruto smirked at his senior and decided to take a jab at him. But you wouldn't get any of the money we'd make, seeing as you don't ever do any of the work. The werewolf huffed through his nose. I would get some of the money, maybe around a quarter or something. I'm the president, right? That's what you're supposed to be. Naruto retorted, idly aware of Sukune rolling his eyes. You're more like a reader, though, or even a guinea pig. You just sit around and read the stuff we write. Yeah. Sukune agreed, jumping into the conversation with a newspaper held in his hands. Maybe if you helped handing out these newspapers, we think of you as more than just a guinea pig, which is down at the bottom of the ladder, right under nearly useless. Gin snatched the paper out of Tsukune's hands. Fine. He sneered, but there was no denying the mirth in his eyes. Frightened shouts, yelps and murmurs broke out in the crowd that had gathered around their club stand. Students parted, and a team of yokai strolled through their black suits, either stoic or dark expressions, the air of superiority about them, and the way they were pushing people out of their way, kind of reminded Naruto of Sasuke. One of them was also telling the students to make way for them, as if they were over 9,000 times more important than everyone. What's going on? Sukune asked as all of them looked at the scene. Well, Sukune, they're pushing and shoving. Naruto remarked offhandedly, placing his hands on the stand and leaning his weight on them slightly, ignoring Tsukune's annoyed glare that he could feel piercing the back of his head. All of them stopped in front of the stand, and Naruto could tell they were putting all their effort into looking intimidating. His eyes zeroed in on the one in the middle. He had the strongest yokai out of all of them by a long shot, so much so that compared to him the other yokai in black suits looked like cheap ripoffs. He had blonde hair like him, only it was darker, and reached his waist in length. Two cold, harsh and sadistic golden eyes were planted in his eye sockets, right below two eyebrows, that might as well have just been dots on his face. He had pointed ears, like one would expect an elf to have, or someone dressing up as an elf for Halloween. So, naturally, Naruto thought the guy looked like he should be wearing a shirt that said, I'm a Lomox. He cracked a smile as the Lomox gave a short bow, his hand resting over his heart with a mocking smile that actually fit his face rather well, as if he'd had a lot of spare time staring in a mirror and practicing. Salutations. I am Kaio, the manager of the Public Safety Committee. I'm pleased to make your acquaintance. Yeah, nice to meet you too. Naruto said, his eyes briefly flickering over to the stoic Gin, before they rested on Kaio again. Okay, seeing as you don't look like you know the drill, I'll let you know. He straightened up and hoped he looked professional. Normally, we don't greet each other like that, we just give you the newspaper and you leave. He raised his eyebrows and leaned forwards, very aware of the tense atmosphere. Wanna give it a shot? Snickers and chuckles were muffled by coughs in the crowd of students. Beside him, Sukune looked away in an attempt to hide his smirk. Kaio's eyes narrowed at him. Unfortunately, we're not here to receive one of your newspapers. We're here to ask a simple question. Wow. Naruto whistled. Must be one important question if so many of you showed up to ask it. So, what? Do you want me to answer whatever question you have one person at a time, or do you want to find out the answer as a group? He could feel that Gin was anxious, and he heard a set of coughs around him from Sukune, Kurumu, and Mocha respectively. A flash of anger entered Kaio's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by cold glee, as if Kaio was planning to slaughter his favorite teddy bear. Naruto guessed it was the best part of his day. The question is, Who gave you permission to hand out a newspaper with the contents that it possesses? He planted the tips of his fingers on the stand and leaned forward, leveling Naruto with a challenging glare, as if to say, I'm going to tear your club down, and you won't be able to do a thing about it. Naruto smiled easily, but he could feel his body tensing in preparation, readying itself for anything Kaio might do. Good question, he said. And it's something I don't have an answer for. From there, Kaio apparently lost it, his nostrils flared, and his leg came up in an arc from under the stand, snapping it half on impact, though Naruto had no idea how he could be that flexible, considering he was a male. Do you not understand what I'm trying to say? Kaio snarled as newspapers fell around him. You don't have permission from us to hand out these newspapers. Therefore what you're doing is illegal. Naruto looked at the destroyed stand for a bit, before giving Kaio an annoyed look. You're paying for that. He ignored the mutterings in the crowd of students about how he was going to get killed. And what does it matter anyway? All we did was post an article about the incident concerning Ishigami. Exactly. The splinter Kaio had caught in his hands lit up in flames, and fell to the ground as small embers. And by doing so you've disturbed the peace in this academy. We are the ones who enforce the rules and keep the peace, which means that a shoddy upstart newspaper club like yourselves needs to get our permission. Naruto frowned as Kaio stepped on a newspaper and squished it into the ground under his foot. Keeping the peace. He hoped his voice sounded mocking. What peace? From what I've seen so far, there's no such thing as peace here, just a bunch of yokai running wild and doing whatever they wish. He scowled, his anger rising at seeing the things the club had worked on treated in such a disrespectful way. So, please, show me this peace that you're talking about, because apparently you're the only one who can see it. Kaio snarled and red-hot flames burst into life in his hands. The crowd of students all took a few steps back, talking excitedly amongst themselves. The public safety committee members took a couple steps back, too, letting Kaio have his space. Naruto sneered back at Kaio, but there was no doubting the excitement he felt. He could practically feel his adrenal gland getting ready to release adrenaline into his system. The kunai popped into his hand, and he gripped it firmly. Before the situation could escalate any further, Naruto felt a hand rest on his shoulder, and he looked to the side, to see Gin with the same stoic expression he had before. That's enough, Naruto, he said before turning his attention on Kaio. Sorry for this, but we know now, so can we just forget this ever happened? We don't want any trouble, Kaio. He said the name with such distaste that it made Naruto think he wanted nothing more than to spill Kaio's guts on the floor. The fire was extinguished from Kaio's hands, and he patted himself down, as if he had ruined his suit by preparing for a fight. Fine. The cruel glint shone in his eyes. Just make sure you keep your underlings in check next time, you mangy dog. We wouldn't want a repeat of last year, now would we? Gin's grip on his shoulder tightened, but he didn't reply. Before the public safety committee had fully left the area, one of their members, a girl with purple hair and eyes, decided to make one last insult to them by standing on a nearby newspaper and tearing it in half with her feet. Naruto glared at her smirking face. The students began to leave, talking amongst themselves as they did so. He sighed and calmed himself down before turning around and facing his friends who all had their own expressions of anger and annoyance. He assumed they'd been sending their own dirty looks Kaio and the members of his committee. Are you okay, Naruto-kun? Mocha asked with concern in her voice. It looked like you were about to start a fight with him. I was going to, Naruto admitted, sending a glance at the werewolf who was still looking in the direction Kaio and his followers had left. Senpai, why did you stop me? I could have just beaten him and they would have left us alone. No, you couldn't have. Gin replied flatly. Look, I want you all to burn those papers. It's the only way they'll leave us alone. Out of the question. Naruto retorted heatedly. When Gin whirled on him with a glare, he stared back with equal intensity, or at least he hoped he did, he couldn't really tell. Don't tell me you're being serious about this, and that you're actually willing to simply bow down to them like that. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Gin snapped back. The public safety committee isn't something you want to mess with, Naruto. A small show of sadness entered his eyes and a tad of hesitance, but it was dashed away a second later, when Gin's entire expression hardened. You will burn the papers, end of story. Why? Naruto crossed his arms stubbornly. Why are you being like this? Who are they exactly? Gin pursed his lips and looked the group over. Either he was trying to see if there was some way he could get out of it, or he was making sure they were all listening. They're the Academy's guardians, and are more or less just over-aggressive student police. I've never seen them before, though, Sukune said. If they're what you say, then why haven't they showed themselves before? I'm not surprised you've never seen them, they barely ever do anything. Gin sighed and ran a hand through his hair. They've become corrupt. These days they're basically just a Yakuza gang, roaming around and taking payments from students for things like protection, or like today, permission for handing out newspapers. They're merciless, too, anyone who gets on their bad side is punished severely. They sound like a bunch of dirtbags. Naruto grumbled and Gin nodded, apparently agreeing with him. They are. But it doesn't change the fact that if we don't listen to them, then, well, let's just say that we'll be on their bad side. Naruto frowned. The way Gin had phrased it made it sound like he'd been on their bad side, which sounded kinda lame. But he went with it anyway, and he didn't like what he found being in that position. So that's it then, senpai. You're just giving in to them like that. Yes. Gin's voice was tight. I'm not going to argue about this, Naruto. Burn the papers. There's nothing to gain with involving ourselves with them, and I don't want any of you getting involved with old fights. He stared at them to make sure no one was going to argue. I don't want to hear another word about this, either. Naruto ground his teeth as Gin turned around and walked off. What a loser. Apparently Kurumu couldn't hold it in any longer. Gin-senpai isn't even thinking like a man. And why did he just leave like that? Naruto tapped his index finger on the table they were seated at outside the cafeteria, just for the sake of something to do. He never really liked sitting in one spot. In the middle of the table was an open box with a bunch of their newspapers. Calm down, Kurumu-chan. He said in an attempt to placate the succubus. I'm sure senpai has his reasons for being the way he is. She wheeled her head around and gave him a glare. How would you know that? They were alone in the area as classes were on, though no one in the group really cared that they were skipping at the moment. The other day he mentioned having a pass with Kaio and consequently the Public Safety Committee, and from the way he acted today coupled with his words about old fights, then I can safely assume it's not a very good pass. Kaio also said something about not wanting a repeat of last year, too. Mocha supplied and he nodded. It doesn't matter what senpai's past with them or his reasons are. Kurumu stood up and slammed her hands down on the table. If he's going to be a coward like this, then I'll just hand the newspapers myself. She grabbed the box in the middle, hefted it up and used her hips to help in carrying it, while she grabbed Tsukune's collar with her free hand. Come on, Tsukune, we'll go hand these papers out. Wait, Kurumu-chan, you can't. Yes I can, Mocha, just watch. She snapped back and began walking off while Tsukune managed to get out of her grip and instead walked alongside her. Whether the human agreed with her or not was a mystery to Naruto. After all, he could have just went along with it, so he didn't have to face the succubus's temper. Mocha sighed and slouched in her chair as the two's forms disappeared around a corner. Why is Kurumu-chan getting so angry? Whether she was aware that she was giving Naruto a free view of her cleavage because of her position was unknown to him, but he didn't complain as he leaned his chin on his hands and used his peripherals to satisfy his hormones. I don't know, Mocha-chan. He flinched when he felt Yukari kick his shin from under the table, and looked over at her to see the young witch glaring at him, as if she was telling him, look at her eyes, no lower. He rolled his eyes while Mocha sat upright in her chair, the dejected expression that had been on her face becoming curious. Naruto-kun, where did you come from? He blinked. Well, He coughed and straightened up. When two people have C. Not like that. She squeaked, her face doing a very good impression of her hair color. I mean, like. She regained her composure, and her face began to return to its usual pale complex. You once said that you came from a place that taught you how to use your yokai, and I was just wondering where that was. Oh? He'd known what she was talking about, but he'd have preferred not to talk about it. But looking at her slightly tilted head, curious expression, her eyes lips which looked ready to pout, he felt himself asking why he wouldn't talk about it in the first place. Why was he avoiding the subject of Konoha so much? Probably because it hurt to even think about it, blah. The mentally strong part of his brain interrupted the depressing part. Just talk about it already. Get it off your chest. Man up, Naruto. Jeez. You're shinobi, not some pitiful and cheap rip-off that you'd find at a second-hand store. Naruto-kun. His attention snapped towards Mocha, and he dismissed the two parts of his brain. The mentally strong side snarled and sneered at him, while the depressed part just looked away with a very Sasuke-like depressing aura about it, as they both disappeared, hopefully to never see the light of day again. Yeah? What is it? You were spacing out, that's all. Yeah. Yukari decided now of all times was best for her to speak up with a cheeky grin on her face. It was like your mind was fighting itself. She snorted to herself, as if the idea of that happening to him was entirely possible, which was backed up by her next sentence. Only someone like you would be able to have a civil war with yourself. Oh, you have no idea, Yukari-chan. He mused, the mischievous side of his brain taking over and planning on what move to make next in their still ongoing war. He shook it off and forcefully pushed it away, and his entire brain kicked back into action, not allowing one side to overthrow the others any longer. So, you ask where I came from, right? Where I once lived. The vampire nodded. Yeah. Well, it was a village known as Konoha. Naruto said. He continued on when he saw her mouth open, and he could almost already hear the question rolling off her tongue. Don't worry if you don't know about it. I doubt anyone alive today would know about it. The village was destroyed a very, very long time ago. Oh? The atmosphere grew awkward. Mocha looked apologetic, not for Konoha's destruction, but for bringing up the subject. He was just glad that she didn't say something like, oh, I'm so sorry. He'd hated it when people said that, whenever someone close to him died, and he just knew he'd hate it if someone were to say it about Konoha. Those set of words just didn't help in any way whatsoever, they actually made it worse. Boy was he grateful, when a bunch of negative emotions hit him, trepidation being the main one, and it was coming from the direction that Tsukune and Kurumu had left in. Sorry to put an end to this nice little conversation, but it seems as though Tsukune and Kurumu-chan managed to get themselves in trouble, and going by what has happened recently, I bet that it's the Public Safety Committee. That's unfair odds. Yukari retorted. He was spot on with his wager, it seemed. He could already hear the slot machines inside his head going crazy and screaming jackpot over and over again. An admittedly very ugly, and oversized spider lady with purple hair was in the process of weaving webs around Tsukune, who looked repulsed at the sight of her. Around 5 meters or so away from that scene, Kurumu was tied up against a tree, the same web-like substance keeping her in place as she stared in shock and horror at what was happening to the human. No matter how much you struggle, you won't get anywhere. The yokai was apparently saying, her voice sounded like clicking sounds. Her 8 thin and totally not human legs were fast at work, weaving the web around Tsukune at a pace that actually impressed Naruto. He tried knitting before. Jiraiya had suggested trying it out on their training trips all those months ago, saying that it would give him some patience. He imagined it was similar in a way. Milka and Yukari went over to Kurumu as soon as they'd laid their sights on her, while Naruto focused his attention on the arachnid lady, who had just sealed Tsukune's mouth shut. Hey, Spider Woman. Over here, pay attention to me in a totally non-obnoxious way. She reared her ugly head around in his direction, showing off a set of jagged teeth that were probably sharp enough to pierce flesh. 2 teeth at least, he thought they were teeth. They were still coming out of her mouth, and all around the size of his forearm reached down to her chin. Her purple eyes didn't have any pupils, and they seemed to have gained an insane, haughty and confident gleam to them. One of her legs kicked a tied-up Tsukune, and he was sent rolling away with a grunt. Ah, so you've come to join the slaughter. She cackled, standing on her 2 human legs, while the other 8 squirmed around. It looked like she was grinning, but he couldn't really tell. Her giant teeth were in the way. Yeah, I'm here, he said. What should he do to her? Sever all of her spider legs. Sure, why not? They were creeping him out anyway. So, the kunai popped into his hand, the tool that was primed and ready to use his special arachnid Oni slice move. Never really been one for beating on girls and all that stuff, but I don't think you really fall under that category anymore. The legs lashed out, stabbing at the air around them, and somehow managing to not hit any of the other limbs. She started to chew, her teeth raking against each other like nails against a blackboard. Her mouth opened in a small O, as if she was preparing to spit. And spit she did. Glorious. Was the first sarcastic thought that went through his head as the web arsed through the air, heading straight for him. He moved his head to the side, staring at the Public Safety Committee member, while clicking his tongue in annoyance, as her spitball of web sailed straight over his shoulder and splatted against the ground behind him. That is absolutely disgusting. He heard Kurumu complain, followed by agreeing words from Mocha and Yukari. I can't help but agreeing with you, Kurumu-chan. He spoke over his shoulder. The bad excuse for Spider-Woman snarled, or at least the spider equivalent of a snarl. This is your only chance, she exclaimed. Seeing as you just arrived, I'll warn you, just like I did for those 2. If you choose to raise your hand against me and try to stop me from killing your friends, then it can only mean death for you. Oh, how humble of you to give someone like me a warning, he said sarcastically, but she seemed to take it the wrong way and actually looked pleased. But I'm afraid I'd rather deal with a death threat from an ugly spider than let my friends die. She dropped down onto the ground, her 8 legs that poked out of her stomach holding her up, presumably getting ready to attack or defend. Then prepared to die, newspaper club scum. He thought about congratulating her on the award-winning insult, but was forced to think about fighting when multiple web spitballs were rocketed at him from her mouth. He weaved in and out of them, not really wanting to get anywhere near them, let alone get hit by one. The sound similar to the one he had been making before when he'd been tapping the table reached his ears, just much more fast-paced and annoying. He brought his attention over to the Public Safety Committee member who was moving towards him with surprising speed for someone with 8 legs. The 2 human legs she still had were dragged along the way, like they were just extra baggage. How nice of you. He smiled as she got closer and closer. His kunai hummed and began to glow in ethereal blue. You know, I think I recognize you. You were the one who destroyed that newspaper earlier today, weren't you? Naruto-kun, be careful. Naruto took Milka's shout in stride. He was ready for the attack, and the kunai was humming away as if the weapon itself was excited. When his enemy was in range, she pounced her 8 spider legs spread wide, as if she was planning on giving him an 8-legged hug of death. Too easy. Maybe it would have been a better idea to get 2 kunai, so that he had a weapon for each side, but it was too late now. He could already feel his arm moving like a whirlwind. There was barely any resistance every time he slashed through a leg, and his kunai sliced through each and every single limb. As soon as the last thin leg had been severed, he placed his hand on her stomach, between where her legs were protruding, and her human legs, using the momentum she'd gained to send her into the air and behind him. It was then that the pain apparently registered in his foe's mind, because she let out an ear-piercing scream that made him wince and scrunch up his face. The oversized spider thumped to the ground, writhing around. It looked like it was trying to get back up, but the stumps which were now its legs didn't look very sturdy, and she kept falling flat on her face. "Can you go any higher in pitch?" Yukari asked, rubbing her temples as if she was trying to forcefully remove the memory of the sound. Eventually she stopped trying and collapsed. Either she just gave up, which was unlikely, or she passed out from the pain. Having 8 legs cut off couldn't have been a very nice feeling. Naruto turned around to face the others. Apparently they'd gone and gotten Tsukune, because he was lying down next to them. Muffled grunts and what he could only guess were complaints coming from his covered mouth. "Be quiet, Tsukune-kun," Milka scolded. Tsukune rolled his eyes, and brought himself up into a sitting position with his legs, which turned out to be more difficult than it seemed, and Kurumu ended up helping him. He stared at Naruto pointedly, as if he was saying, "What are you standing there for? Hurry up and cut me loose. And don't laugh." The blonde grinned slightly and walked over, the kunai in his hand humming with chakra again. My, Tsukune, I didn't know you were into bondage." He said the Kido was defeated. Kaio demanded, his eyes boring into his 2 subordinates who stood at attention and nodded at his question. "It seems that the newspaper club does indeed intend to fight us, then." His eyes went around to room and boredom, from the one light hanging from the roof, to the dark walls, to the equally dark ceiling, a perfect setting for an underground club. "Fine, if that is what they so foolishly wish, then I'll destroy them with my own hands." An amused-sounding chuckle reached his ears, and his eyes snapped in the direction it had come from. His 2 subordinates tensed in preparation, but otherwise stayed still. My, it seems as though you're getting ahead of yourself." In the dimly lit room, all Kaio was able to make out was a white coat and a pair of slim jeans to go along with the feminine voice. By the woman's posture, he could only guess that she were leaning against the wall. "Even you wouldn't be able to destroy a club for no reason. Who are you?" "Me? Oh, I'm just someone who wants to get even with someone from the same club that you want destroyed." He wagered that there was a smirk on her face. Anyway, back to more important matters. "How do you intend to destroy the newspaper club?" He wasn't going to reply, but she continued on as if she hadn't expected him to anyway. "If only there was something, just one bit of information that would grant you the ability to destroy them." His eyes narrowed. "What do you know?" "About the newspaper club?" "Quite a bit, actually. And it just so happens that I have that one bit of information that would allow you to destroy them." "Tell me. Everything." Thanks for listening. I do hope you enjoyed. If you want the next part of this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. And also check out the other videos that I have created, and enjoy. See you in the next video. Peace.